so excited to see our presentation on the National Health Service. So take us away, Leslie.
Thank you. And the video that I'm going to play is longer than 35 minutes, so I may intervene and move it along a little bit. So I'm Leslie Goodburn. I work at NHS England, the National Health Service in England. I'm going to share with you today a panel discussion about a digital story called Mohammed Azam, A Legacy for Today. And it's the story of a South Asian gentleman admitted to hospital in February 2021 during the Omicron variant part of the pandemic. And it explores issues around discrimination, racism, health inequalities, and sort of takes that view. So the panel discussion is with myself, someone from the region, the area in the UK, in the Yorkshire area, someone who looks at particular parts of the health service from a place perspective, and featured heavily is Shabia Azam, the daughter. So we'll play the film as part of the panel discussion. So I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to do this so well and so swiftly. I can see the share screen button. Well, hopefully you can see that. And as I say, I may just intervene and move it forward a little bit to fix on time.
Looking good.
Okie doke. Hopefully you can hear it shortly.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see you today. We're recording this session. We can't do it live, unfortunately, but we're recording this session. It's about Mohammed Azam, A Legacy for Today, a digital story that NHS England, both at a national level and a regional level, helped Shabia Azam to share her story of her father's experience during COVID. So I'm really happy to welcome Shabia. Shabia, do you want to just say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Leslie, and it's a pleasure to be joining you all. I guess from a patient advocate point of view, I'm really glad to be able to highlight my dad's digital story with the help of NHS England, and really hope that a lot of the key learnings from that you'll be able to take away and implement in your field of experience and work.
Thank you, Shabia. And Penny, you're from NHS West Yorkshire Integrated Care Board. Do you want to tell us about you and what you do?
Yeah, hi everybody, and thanks Leslie for the intro. So, hello, my name's Penny Woodhead. I'm the Director of Nursing. I work in 3 areas in the West Yorkshire Integrated Care Board as the Director of Nursing and Quality, and I've been working alongside colleagues on the call, particularly about the learning from Mohammed's story and how we take that forward locally with our NHS and care providers.
Thank you, Penny. And last but not least, we've got Sarah Clasper from the regional team at NHS England. Sarah?
Thanks, Leslie. Yes, I'm Sarah Clasper, and I work in the North Eastern Yorkshire regional team for NHS England, in the nursing and quality team, and I'm experience of care lead for my region. And I've been working with everybody on the call and with Shabia for the past year or so around Mohammed's story, which is why I'm here today.
Thanks, Sarah. And everyone, my name's Leslie Goodburn. I work at NHS England in the National Experience of Care team, and I've had the pleasure of working with Shabia, Penny and Sarah over the last 18 months or so, sharing Mohammed's story and also making sure that we're able to learn from it and evidence the learning. So Mohammed Azam, A Legacy for Today is a digital story. It charts Mohammed's experience and the family's experience of being admitted alone to a hospital, an acute hospital in the north of England in February 2021 at the height of the Omicron pandemic. It explores issues around health inequality, racism, discrimination, and the abstract we submitted to the conference was around bias, whether bias was conscious or unconscious. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now just watching Mohammed's story, and then we'll come back to the panel and ask some questions around the work that we've done, how it's impacted, what people's roles have been, and what the legacy is for Mohammed, the legacy for today. So I'm going to flip over to the film. We'll watch the film for 10 or 12 minutes or so, and then we'll come back to the room and start the panel discussion.
COVID, end of January 2021, we were all really shocked, but as the trooper that he was, like, no visits, please don't trouble yourself, I don't need anything, I've got all the medication. He was very much the type of guy that I'd have a medication for everything. So much as sneeze and he'd have a spoon of something ready for you. So yes, so really he took it upon himself to kind of nurse himself. Quite resilient. He didn't want to go to the hospital. He didn't want to call the ambulance or what have you. And he was like, I can fight this. But it became evident that over the days, speaking to him every day, that his condition was getting a lot worse. You know, he was a massive community champion. He worked with the local doctors within the community to make sure that, you know, people were testing early. So he left with the ambulance service having my details of next of kin written on his paperwork, you know, everywhere that they needed to put it. And he kind of went into the system. After 4 days of us ringing around, trying to find out where he was, what had happened, we'd had no contact. We'd ring up the local hospitals and they'd be like, oh, he could have gone to a different hub, he could have been somewhere else. No one knew where he was. So it broke down from the minute he kind of put that phone down and said, oh, you know, the ambulance is here, I'll be fine. His trust was fully within them, and that's the minute it kind of broke down. It took 4 days in order for us, the family, to track him down, and that's kind of going through the ambulance service, the local hospital hubs, different wards, because we found him. He was in a respiratory ward at the local hospital, which we'd rang before, but they didn't confirm that he was there. And on this occasion, a nurse had answered and said, oh, Mohammed Azam, yeah, we have him here. And her first comment to me was that, oh, I was thinking that it was strange that he didn't have next of kin, considering you have big families. So I guess the relief of knowing that he was alive kind of overlooked the comment that was made. I then asked the nurse to put his phone on. They switched his phone on. And, you know, that's where Dad was still able to talk. He was just on the normal oxygen. And, you know, he kept saying that he's in a room with a broken window. It's really windy. It's really cold. And being a diabetic, he was kind of, you know, using his oxygen to keep himself warm as opposed to actually keeping his lungs fully open. So we knew that, you know, he wasn't in the ideal environment for him to actually beat this condition. They didn't have the blankets to give him, so we had to bring blankets in for him. So they'd left him like that. So we bought back blankets in that same day. The following day, he was still really cold to the point he'd sent us some pictures and he was literally like blue fingernails. So we spoke to the ward again and they were like, we can't move him. If you want, bring a heater in. So it's very much, the onus was very much left on us to be able to do all of this for my dad, bearing in mind they didn't want any family on the wards and they didn't want people coming into the hospital because that's where transmission kind of happens. But they were all right for us to bring those, you know, what he needed in for him. Managed to get the number for HDU and it just kept ringing out. His phone had gone silent by then. There was no charge on his phone and it was really hard trying to get a communication channel open with HDU. Days of, again, trying to get through, leaving messages. I finally had a call from a junior registrar who explained that, you know, Dad's situation was quite dire. He deteriorated quite a lot. It now was on CPAP, and to my astonishment he announced that there was a DNR placed on his file. There was no discussions of a DNR with his family. There was no discussions as to what the reasons were given for this DNR. And I guess the biggest regret that I guess we all have, and what's most heartbreaking, is that his final call that they made for him to be able to speak to his family members, they actually FaceTimed an incorrect family. So that was the last time before they actually started sedation, because they thought what they told us, that he now had COVID of the brain as well, so he was becoming delirious. So right before sedation, they FaceTimed the wrong family. And as my dad had said to them that I don't recognise these, they just thought he's become delirious and they actually left him on for half an hour with not his immediate or right family. And I only found that out because the day after, the next morning I rang and I was like, I'm still waiting for this Zoom call. And they were like, oh, we've done the Zoom. And I was like, you've not done the Zoom with us. And they were like, oh, we're really sorry, but we did do a Zoom with the family in the morning. You know, so that was heartbreaking, the fact that we didn't get that chance to say goodbye to Dad for the very last time when he was of sane mind. Another instance that we found was when we were getting through to the nurses, and at this point, you know, I'd made a point of my dad's bed number, his carer for the day.
you know, where he would be in his routine, you know, what his numbers were looking like. And I'd rang up on one occasion when he was in HDU. I gave his name, date of birth, the bed that he was in, even the name of the carer that was looking after him that day. And I was told, oh, he's made a significant improvement, Mohammed has. He's sat up and he's actually having some tea. And, you know, I was absolutely thrilled. Text my family, text everybody, said that, oh, you know what, Dad's going to come out of this. He's actually sat up and they've given us, you know, they're quite positive. And then kind of left it and rang again after 4 hours, as I would do, to check up on him again. And on this occasion did the same, gave the right information, and got told that, oh, actually your dad's CPAP requirement's gone up and that was the wrong Mohammed. We've got 2 Mohammeds on the ward. That was completely devastating to know that they were actually mixing him up with another patient, giving out incorrect information. And actually, again, he'd deteriorated in that period where we as a family were actually celebrating the fact that he you know, he's going to beat this thing. And I guess throughout of all of those encounters, we felt utterly helpless. You know, there's nothing that we could have done. There's nothing that we could have done to guide them, to change, you know, what was happening, because it was a clear lack of their understanding, you know, of kind of making pre-assumptions, not the relevant training, not the right support that was going on in that period of time. And, you know, it was just devastating as a family, because we knew that if we're living this from a second narrative, my dad was living this firsthand. I guess it eventually came to a point where we did get a call to say that, you know, we don't think that he's going to survive. We're not going to ventilate him because there's a very low chance of him coming off ventilation. And, you know, you kind of go into autopilot at that point and forget everything that's happened before then, and just want to do the right thing from that minute moving forward. Yes, the day before we had an inkling as to what had gone on, and you know, my dad was in a very COVID place. He was on the red ward. There was literally no one allowed in or out, and even NHS staff, it was limited to those that were actually allowed to sign in and out of those wards. But knowing that they had given us wrong information, not kept the right next of kin, and the fact that they'd FaceTimed the wrong family, they actually allowed my brother to come see him before they'd made the decision to turn off his life support, which was, you know, it was twofold. It was contradicting in what they were saying, as no one's allowed on. You know, it was kind of saying, oh yeah, we've done wrong here, you know, throwing us a piece of string, because, you know, he had to go through PPE, he had to go see my dad and actually sit with my dad and see the state that he was in. The fact that he hadn't had his 4-hourly lip cares done, he had secretion built on his lips, which was fusing his lips together, which was why he was trying to remove his mask, which is one of the reasons why they were saying that they were going to start sedation, because he was trying to pull his mask off. So like the picture was becoming very clear as to what was going on in terms of his care. Then the following day we got that call to say, yes, you know, indeed, now we think that it's you know, that it's in his interest to actually let him go. This is just prolonging his suffering. And at that point we got the opportunity to have one person to say goodbye, but because they'd allowed my brother the day before, it kind of robbed anybody else to take that last opportunity with him. It was only him that was allowed to go back to say goodbye. He had to go alone and say goodbye to Dad. And you know, he's still fairly young. He went in, he wasn't briefed on the fact that your dad would be still conscious and awake. We were expecting Dad to be quite heavily sedated, because that's what they'd told us. But he obviously went in and Dad was alert. He was very aware of what was happening. So it fell on my brother to explain to him what's going to happen, which was very difficult. So my dad was acutely aware. He was very aware that as soon as they removed the CPAP, that he would be dying, which I think, you know, adds to the fact that it adds to this unknown suffering of, I guess, what he went through whilst he was in that hospital care. And subsequently, once Dad had passed and we were actually given his belongings, within his belongings, Dad had kind of kept a journal almost of how he was being treated. And there was 2 kind of key consistent messages that were written within his journal. And kind of his writing deteriorated to the point where it was almost like a child, like maybe a couple of days before. And he wrote the same message that, you know, they weren't coming to give him water and he was being constantly shouted at. And those were the 2 key messages that we got after he'd passed out from kind of beyond the grave that were left behind from him. And that's when we as a family kind of sat back and thought, you know, we felt such despair that we couldn't do anything to support him in his last 3 weeks, especially the last 2 that he spent in the hospital.
but he actually gave us a reflection of what his time was like in the NHS. It's almost coming up to a year, but even now I'll meet people in the community and they'll come and pay their respects for me losing my dad, but they'll always say, but you should never have sent him to hospital. It's almost saying to me that I sent my dad to his death. And I'm sure that these people don't mean the upset it causes us as a family, but that's what it's akin to us sending him to his death. And that's the level of distrust there is within the community, that people think that they can come up to a grieving family or a grieving daughter and say, if you hadn't have sent your dad into hospital, he'd still be alive.
And I know that if he was alive, he would say, oh, it's okay, they were under a lot of pressure and it doesn't matter. We should think about all the things that they did get right and they did manage to do. And I went through a phase of feeling really angry for a long period of time, but at the same time, we are all human and we make mistakes, and it's about correcting and learning from them, like you said, and going forwards. And I just hope that everyone can be treated like an individual wherever they are.
I think everyone who's watched Mohammed's film will understand the impact of some of the biases that come through the film. We can debate whether they were conscious or unconscious biases, but what we can't debate, what is absolutely certain, is the impact on Mohammed and his family. So I wanted to say thank you to Shabir and the Azam family for being brave and sharing that story, because I know it's difficult to share personal stories and information. So thank you, Shabir and the family, so much for being brave enough to share the story. And thanks to Penny and Sarah for the work that they've done, and lots of other people who have taken that work forward. So a few little questions that I'm going to pose to people, and maybe I'll start with Sarah. Sarah, is that okay if I ask you the first question?
Absolutely fine, Leslie.
So how did you experience bias, or conscious or unconscious, via the story? And what was the impact of the story for you?
I think if I start in terms of the impacts, I think I met Shabir through a colleague in the regional team, and Shabir actually came to our online event and very bravely told the story live, as it were. Which I can't really. I mean, it's really difficult to explain the impact of hearing that firsthand for the first time as well. And I think what absolutely struck me was, I guess, Shabir's tenacity in telling that story, and I think hearing, as I heard the story for the first time, there were so many points throughout the story where, you hear it and you think, oh my goodness, that's dreadful. And you almost can't believe what you're hearing. And then the next point comes, and the next thing, and the next thing. And I think what was really overwhelming was that, what happened to Mohammed throughout his care at the end of his life wasn't, it wasn't one-off thing here, one small mistake there. It just seemed to be, the whole experience was embedded. And so starting to think about, actually, culturally, what is it about our organisation, the care that we're providing, that makes that experience happen. And I think that was the thing that struck me, most. And I guess that's where, we got to on the call as well with the other people that were listening. There were so many staff on that call that started to say, I don't know, we didn't reveal where the care was, but there were so many people on that call that started to say, this could have been my organisation. I can imagine this being my trust. And I think that was the bit that really struck me, that we weren't talking about, a one-off incident, a one-off issue, that actually there was something about, culturally, our processes, our systems, our staff, everything that had kind of enabled this to happen, allowed this to happen. And I think for me that was the bit. And you know, reflecting a lot on just on storytelling generally, I think you don't ever get that from any other metric, any patient survey, any interview or anything like that, you know, until you hear that firsthand, that full experience, and the richness of it.
Thank you, Sarah. Penny, same question to you.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks so much for going first, but I've written on my piece of paper so many of the words that you've used there, so I am going to say some of them as well, because I think that's really about the impact of the story. So I came a bit later to hearing about Mohammed's story, the Azam family story. I'd heard the story through a director of nursing network, and well, I think the phrase that keeps coming back to me, I was absolutely horrified about what I heard, and I kept having to really pinch myself and think, could that really have happened? Did that really happen? I don't work in frontline practice on a day-to-day basis. The storytelling is really, really important for me because it really connects me back with what happened. And I just thought, grief as a nurse, really? Could that really be the case? And I am also I've worked in end of life care for a long time, so the thought of somebody towards the end of their life and experiencing as a family some of those things that were happening, it really got to the heart of me, the pit of my stomach, really making me feel we need to do something different. So you said something about it not being one thing, and for me there's something about systemic learning here. So we often find ourselves in looking for a root cause of an issue, and what's the issue. So we could talk about the pandemic, or we could talk about X or Y, but actually there were so many things in here to do with the pandemic, to do with policy, procedure, basic cultural competency, and practice in operation, that actually looking at it in a systemic way to think about improvements absolutely necessary. But then I also thought about almost 35 years in the NHS this year, so working in health and care environments across community services, primary care and acute hospitals, and I thought, what are the most seminal learning points for me in that time? And they've been about individual stories, and that's why this is really important for me, is that this is an individual story that there's so much to learn from, and actually we need to be able to grasp that and put the mirror up to us and say, could this happen? Could I do this? Could this be the way that my department operates, my teams, and think about the things that we could do differently and challenge ourselves in that space. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight around where I was coming from in terms of particularly the impact element of this.
Thanks, Penny. And I suppose same question to you, Shabir, but of course it's not the impact of the story, because you kind of lived it. It is your story as well as your dad's story.
Yeah, and I guess, living with it on a daily basis is what gives us the courage to be able to be part of the change. So I think in terms of whether it was conscious or unconscious bias, I think a lot of my dad's care was just founded on the fact that it was ignorance. It was ignorance to his culture, his ethnicity, even down to his age and other comorbidities that he had, because assumptions were made in his care. So I think a lot of it was conscious, but there is an element of unconscious, because if that training isn't afforded to staff, if they don't know any better, and if they're not supported by their organisations, then these ignorances will come to the foreplay, which they did with my dad's story. And I think, as you've heard right from the very beginning, with the throwaway comments in the sense that we have large families, that is purely down to ignorance. And I think things like that can be easily learned, they can be easily developed, and they can easily be supported, which is why I think my dad's story goes from the very subtle changes that I needed to the very extreme changes that I needed. So it's a broad spectrum of learning, but certainly, conscious and unconscious bias are a very big part of that. But in terms of impact, you know, for us, not only did we, I guess, lose Dad, but we lost him knowing that his last few days on earth were just marred with the fact that he had no self-respect, dignity or self-worth left in those few days because of the ignorances that existed, but also the conscious biases that were, you know, that were brought to him. I think, you know, as a family, we're very aware of it. We've grown up with it. We're first-born migrants here. You know, it's something that we've experienced in everyday life, in everyday culture, you know, in work, in wherever you want to name it. So when we talk about systemic, it is systemic in part of society, which is why I think when a person goes into the healthcare system, they're entwined together to a certain extent. So yeah, I guess the impact is very much there in terms of how we're still suffering as a family, but the main impact that we want to work with and highlight today is the changes that will happen with my dad's story and the learnings that will come away from my dad's story, I guess.
Thanks, Shabir. And, you know, having worked on the story and worked with you all over the last 18 months, there are kind of earworms from the story that just stay in my head. That comment about you know, I wondered why there was no next of kin because you've always got big families, is the one that always just resonates back. And I think that is unconscious bias. It's just something that's learned and somebody said it and didn't think of the impact of saying that. So thanks everyone. So I'll come back to Penny if that's okay. Penny, what have you learned from being involved in sharing the story and the work that's been being taken place since?
Yeah, so I'm involved in at a few different levels around the story. So I have a job which is one to ensure that the organisation where Mohammed spent his last few days of his life actually take action themselves, and that we're able to see that truly embedded within the organisation. So that's a day-to-day conversation with that particular organisation, and whether that's their director of nursing or their person that leads from an experience point of view, through their education and training department. So making sure that this is a very live conversation, because as we've said, you know, the systemic changes need to take place to be able to ensure that nobody else experiences this type of care and bias at that level. And Shabir, I'm with you in terms of it is an experience that many people have, which is not right, and intertwined with societal biases. I'm involved in something in another part of West Yorkshire, which the first time I saw it was just like, what have my team had in most recent training around cultural competence? What have we been doing with our teams, that this is something that doesn't just happen when you're going through your undergraduate training or a particular training course? It is something that we're talking about on an ongoing basis. So it becomes something that is conscious in terms of our appreciation of different experiences, different cultures, different backgrounds. So I've got a trust role to be able to make sure that actions are taken, but also then from what are the critical points in the story here that we can actually think about influencing health and care services within a local population. And we know the population that Mohammed and Shabir's family come from. We know the community very well, and we know they were significantly impacted through the COVID pandemic. They were impacted from a deprivation perspective long before the pandemic. The pandemic's highlighted that, and I think I'm using the story as a let's shine the light on some of the underlying issues in that particular community, and let's listen to similar stories and think about the complexities of the health and care system for people to be able to navigate and think about co-producing solutions that build trust and confidence in an unwieldy, complex system in terms of navigating health and care. So those are a couple of the things that I'm involved.
Shabia, anything kind of you've learned about yourself or your family from sharing the story?
Yeah, I think a lot of the values that Dad instilled in us, I think, you know, one of his key things when he arrived in the UK was very much about integration. And I think, you know, having seen the work that he did in the community in terms of being an ambassador for healthcare, and then, you know, me and my brothers and sisters growing up and being very part of that community, I think, you know, a lot of the values that he's instilled in us has come to the forefront. But then we've also been lucky enough to partner with organisations such as, you know, IMWS within West Yorkshire, who we recently held a local event with for Dad's legacy and Dad's story. So I think, you know, if anything, it's made us stronger and it's made us more determined to be able to actually be part of the solutions and be part of how we can certainly address the conscious and unconscious biases within Dad's story, and you know, how we can play a part within Penny's broader role to be able to build that trust between our communities and just ensure people are seeking, you know, the right healthcare alternatives for them at the right time, and not using instances such as my dad's to actually say this is the reason why we don't, you know, go for early diagnosis or early treatment.
Thanks, Shabia. One of the things I've learned from sharing your dad's story is that we were able to take the story to the NHS England Quality Board, which has senior people from the NHS, the Chief Nursing Officer Ruth May, the Chief Medical Officer Steve Powis, and many other chief officers of various different titles. And through that work, we were able to share Mohammed's story and get support to be able to work with the local community. So the one thing that I've learned is that NHS England might want to improve lots of things and do lots of things, but actually the really important thing has always been, from Shabir and the family, to have some community conversations about how we break down some of the barriers, how we challenge some of the cultural competency, understanding the conscious and unconscious bias. So there's a whole load of work going on from an NHS England point of view, but the spearhead for that work has been the family and what the family wanted. So it's very much around digital stories driving the storyteller's agenda. And if we can do other things that improve things as well, that's great. So I think that's the one thing I've learned, that the storyteller holds the power, and it should be about what the storyteller wants from that conversation and sharing the story.
Just conscious that we're kind of running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to skip the bit about measurements and just go towards the end of the recording.
And Leslie, this is so valuable. You have until 14:30. You're the panel for today's session.
Oh, okay.
You have the whole time. Your virtual session 3 until 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. So you can let it play.
But I'll let it play that.
Apologize for misspeaking.
Sarah, anything from you?
Yeah, I think probably, you know, similar to what others have said. I think I think, you know, reflecting on Mohammed's story, it did highlight for me as well, you know, how far we've got to go. It sometimes does feel like a long road ahead, but I think one of the positives has been the collaborative working. So, you know, IMWS, the voluntary sector organisation that's been mentioned by Shabia there, and working with the ICB and the Trust and others. You know, we've been able to connect up and start those community conversations that right from the start, when I first met Shabia, that was one of the things you said to me, Shabia, that you really wanted your dad's story to be a catalyst for, you know, for positive change. And I think that I've learned, I think that's one of the things that I will take away. I think that collaborative approach, and what we've been able to do is, you know, we've looked at doing things at different levels, and you've mentioned there, Leslie, about the National Quality Board. Penny, you know, referencing the work that's happening locally and those community conversations as well. And that's been a real learning and a real positive, I think, for us as well. think, you know, Penny, you talked about making sure that the things that went wrong, if we speak frankly about that, the things that went wrong are put right, quite simply, and that we can, you know, look for the assurance for that, because that's really important that we've shared that, and that happens. And I think, you know, the compassion that's been shown by Shabia and her family towards the NHS, to understand that, you know, you know, things do go wrong, things aren't always you know, mistakes aren't intentionally made. I've found that really humbling throughout this whole piece of work, because actually without that compassion and that openness to work together from the family, we wouldn't be where we are now.
Thanks, Sarah. And we're going to share in just a few minutes an impact and outcomes framework that we've been working on for digital stories, that will show where Mohammed's story has been, who's seen it, what the impact has been, what the actions have been. But one of the final questions is just, I'm probably going to come to you first for this one, Shabia. So what's the impact of the work, and how do you think your dad's story might contribute to a more just future for others?
Yeah, I think over the last couple of years, we've had you know, an enormous amount of traction in terms of my dad's digital story being used at events within NHS at different levels. I think the community event that we did with Nadeem Raja and the IMWS was incredibly powerful, because we had leaders from the community, but also community elders, who actually are part of the conversation in terms of building that trust back with the NHS. But we've also had a lot of impact in terms of us as a family being able to be able to not only grieve dad, but celebrate the man that he was, knowing that he died really alone and really frightened. You know, it could have gone one of the other way. We could have fallen into that whole point of blame and retribution, or we could have gone the way that we wanted to go, which was actually use dad's story to make a change, which, you know, thankfully that's the way it's gone. We had the NHS Confederation Expo just a couple of days ago, which was, you know, we had 500 plus in the audience which heard our dad's story, and they were all leaders of their respective areas within the NHS system, so they were going to take that away as learning. So I think, you know, it's been incredibly impactful, but I'm also incredibly grateful for the, you know, for the work that NHS England has done with us. You know, it's reaffirmed the reasons why we're doing this. Of course it's painful, you know, it's of course on occasions when people do come up to you and ask you, why aren't you angry, you know, why are you wanting to help make a change, you know, it does take you back. And I think to myself, anger as an emotion doesn't get you anywhere. Of course we're angry my dad died alone and frightened in those last days of his life, but if we just held on to anger, we won't be able to do anything with it, and we'd be grieving a man that we lost in those last 3 days, and not for the 69 years that he was here doing the good that he did. So I think that's incredibly important, and that's really impactful. But also, you know, I'd implore anyone that's listening in this conversation that my dad's story strikes a chord with you, then, you know, please use his learnings, and, you know, use what happened to him as a means for good. You know, reference my dad's name so it lives on. You know, I want his legacy to be part of an everyday learning package or a learning development piece for NHS England for staff coming on board, because like we said, some of the things are just really easily to capture at onboarding, are so easy to capture for community training in terms of that cultural and, you know, diversity background piece. So I think longevity is going to be really important moving forward, so that that story can continue to have an impact. But I think up until now, it's, but from a family point of view, we're really grateful for, you know, for Leslie, Sarah, Penny, Nadeem, all the rest of the steering committee that have really pulled together and got the resources in place to dad's story to not only be here with you today, but to have a significant impact in the UK health service.
Thanks, Shabia. Penny?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Every time I listen to Shabir talk about this, it just warms my heart. Some of the things that you say, you're just an amazing, amazing woman. So the values that you talk about in terms of the ones that your dad had, we talk about that kindness and compassion, and that's what this, you know, coming into this feeling that we can make a difference. from a place of kindness, compassion, empathetic, and being brave. So one of the big things for me is about encouraging those community, from a health and care leadership perspective, to be in the room and be present, to hear stories, to hear your dad's story, and to sit there with the pain of that for as long as they can, for them to then think about, well, what is it that I can do? What can I hold myself to account for taking forward some action, and be brave in that space. But also to be really supportive of people that come forward in that advocacy, champion, influencing role. So that's a huge impact for me, Shabir, for you, in terms of you're a massive influencer on an agenda here that is so important for us in health and care system today. And when you talk about we had a in relative terms, a small community conversation a few months ago in our bit of West Yorkshire, didn't we? With some very, very significant community leaders, that people were brave and were present, and was a really powerful evening. To then you talk about, well, I sat on a stage, part of a panel with 500 people sat listening. I'm thinking, that's brave, but it's significant influence, and that's just so powerful for me, thinking about your dad's legacy.
I think just for me, the impact of the story is how far it's reached, who it's gone to, what actions people have taken, the fact that we've been able to kind of build the evidence of what has happened with the story, which I'll share shortly. And also the fact that many NHS hospitals have used Shabir's story and a dad's story to kind of open up conversations about equality, diversity and inclusion. And in some ways, the fact that the experience didn't happen in their hospital has allowed them to explore that more than perhaps they would if it had happened in their hospital. So that little bit of distance gives people the opportunity to explore some of those fundamental issues that you talked about, Shabir, in terms of inclusion, discrimination, health inequalities and racism. So an enormous impact. And I think the most impactful thing for me was being in Leeds, being with the Indian Muslim Welfare Society that we've talked about in an acronym. What is it? The IMWS.
Yeah.
But being in the community in which you live and in which your dad lived, and to watch the story in that community with people who have experienced similar things, was just really, really impactful for me, and really humbling to be there, to be part of that conversation, and to know that we can take forward that work around trust, mistrust, and a more just future for people from the South Asian community. So I'm going to share with you the impact and outcomes framework. It's something we've worked on for all digital stories and stories that we share across NHS England and the various different hospital trusts. It looks at 6 key areas. So I'm going to share with you, as I mentioned, the impact and outcomes framework that we've developed for digital stories and any kind of story really. But I'm going to share the outputs for Mohammed Azam, a legacy for today. So we designed the impact and outcomes framework based on these infographics, which is about where it's been shared, what kind of feedback we've had from the story, actions that have taken place. Amplification is the number of people who've seen the story either through video or at face-to-face events, what it's improved and what the impact has been. So Mohammed's story has been shared at 1 board, 5 conferences and 4 workshops. We've got over 200 individual messages of feedback. We've got 16 actions, 120 views of the video, 920 people, and it's improved the awareness of some of the issues around inclusion, and the impact is that we've got multiple initiatives underway. So underneath each of those boxes is the information that charts where the story's been, what date. The key to the colours on this slide are dark blue are what the regional team, Sarah and Penny, have done, and light blue is what the national team have done. So I won't read all those out, but you can see that that impact and outcomes there in terms of where it's been shared. The feedback often is composed of word clouds. So here are some of the word clouds from various different sessions. And then individual pieces of feedback from individuals who've seen the story. So thank you for sharing this video story. There are some awful, sad, negative themes. I think the worst thing is that the themes are familiar. She is an advocate for others who can't speak for themselves, and her dad's story has powerful learning, a reminder and a reminder of the importance of including family. Appreciating the required cultural awareness. This is mainly about kindness, care, consideration and communication. Thank you so much for sharing. I will retell your story to our teams as a reminder of the basics being so important. This is the one that always gets me. We failed, we let them down, we must learn. And so it goes on. We have over 200 pieces of feedback. In terms of where it's been shared, so what the actions, so we've had the regional team have supported Shabia and the family to chair a working group. So it has been Shabia and the family who've decided where it goes, what the impact might be and what they would like to happen. You can see the different colours again, dark blue being the regional work, light blue being the national work. There's also purple there, and the particular hospital involved has got its own impact and outcomes framework that they're working through that we're not able to share with you today, but there is a whole impact and outcomes framework for the hospital too. And then planned, we've got some work planned. We've also included there, which we're doing today, presenting at the 11th International Digital Storytelling Conference. We were very lucky that Shabia was able to join a national exhibition conference, the Confed Expo for the NHS. About 500 people joined her in a room on a panel where she shared the impact of the story, the cost of discrimination and the benefits of tackling it in the NHS. So that was a really good impact too. We've talked on the story on the panel discussion about the work that we did with the Indian Muslim Welfare Society. This was on the 8th of March. We, through the society, pulled together people from the local community, people in the South Asian community in the north of England, to talk through the impact of the story, to watch the story, to talk through the impact of the story, to capture their reflections, how we can involve the community much more in the health conversations that need to take place, how we can come together to improve experience, and to plan this event later in the summer. So here's a little bit of a bigger insight into that. So later in the summer, in end of August, end of July, beginning of August, we're going to have an event where we'll talk to ambassadors and community champions. We'll have health screening sign-ups. We'll do more work with religious groups. We'll hear the voices of the local community, and we'll do that in local community venues, and make it not just an event that happens in the summer, but a series of events that begin to explore trust and distrust in the local community with health and care services. In terms of the number of people who've seen it, underneath there are all the list of events. It's improved the understanding of microaggressions and issues of trust in the South Asian communities. It's set up a process of identification of patients when using virtual visited. It's contributed to the setup of a care partner advisory board. So from a national level, we are working at NHS England on a care partner policy. And it started an ongoing conversation in the local community about health inequalities and ways of working to engage the local community. It was shared with the National Director for End of Life Care, who rather than just watch it and maybe use it in one session, said, I thought you'd like to know, and Mohammed's daughters might like to know too. It had a very powerful effect and stimulated lots of discussion, particularly about assumptions and how it affected so much of his experience and that of the family. The conversations that were stimulated by the teaching session are still going on, and it has created some soul searching about how policy guidelines and framework can be reduced to tasks and what we need to do to push away from that kind of reductionism. We're going to have a follow-up session to discuss, so what should we do as a national team about this? Once again, thank you for provoking all this for us. Also, the workforce equality, race equality lead said, the heartbreak in the voice adds to the poignancy of the story. It should be a real trigger for all of us in the NHS to think about the assumptions and prejudices we carry with us. We'll share confidentially with the team, and we'll put our heads together to think about similar learning opportunities raised by colleagues. Emma, who is a lead for patient experience at one of the trusts in London, has used it at her Equality and Diversity Committee. So her first step as the head of patient experience is to look at how we use this story to talk about organisational culture and change in a much more open and honest way, and that we see changes in how staff feel to come to work and do their jobs, and how patients and families feel when they come to our hospitals. She also says she once saw a sign in a care home that said, our residents do not live in our workplace, we work in their home. We need to change the mindset that a hospital needs to feel and look so different to our homes. Why is it when we're at our most vulnerable and poorly, we come to huge white buildings with sounds and smells that are so alien to us, and then people don't communicate or care for us in a way that we need? And the final bit of impact is feedback from the family. Thank you to everyone who's supported us to share our dad's story. We're so pleased with the way in which we've been able to drive the improvements and facilitate understanding for staff in the NHS. So that's just an example of some of the impact and outcomes of Mohammed's story. If you want to use Mohammed Ozam, A Legacy for Today, we're happy to supply you with the link. We're also happy to supply you with a copy of the Impact and Outcomes framework that you can fill in, and we'd be very happy to incorporate your feedback and evidence into our outcomes and impacts framework, which we are applying to all our different kinds of storytelling to build an evidence base around what can be achieved evidentially. So we'll go back over to the panel and continue with the discussion. Thank you so much for listening. And I am really pleased to share with you what's changed as a result. Thank you for listening to me talk about the Impact and Outcomes framework. We're back now for the final question. So Penny, just in terms of the story, what do you see Mohammed's legacy being?
So the legacy for me is going to be that ongoing dialogue in our place around improving health and care services for the population.
I think the legacy for me, it will be around the longer term learning, the opportunity for the longer term learning. So in terms of the support resources that we're in the process of developing, that the opportunity to prompt discussion and challenge, and to prompt action as well. For me, a big part of that is the so what. So you've heard the story, you've heard what went wrong.
Really important for us as a family that meaningful action is taken, so results is really important, and some of the framework will show to you what we've managed to achieve in this time. But yeah, a lot to what Penny and Sarah have said. It is the longevity in this piece.
Thanks, Shabia. Thanks, Penny. Thanks, Sarah. I think for me, Mohammed Ozam, A Legacy for Today, the title says it all. It is a legacy for today. It is something that we can all join together on. I think it just shows that everyone is the same, that when we connect on a human level and understand people's pain, understand people's suffering, that we can connect, we can join together, and we can make a difference. So thank you, Sarah, thank you, Penny, and particularly thank you, Shabia, and the family for sharing your dad's story. We'll all continue to support it, and we'll be able to move over there's some questions and answers at the live panel. We're sorry we couldn't be with you live, but birthday celebrations were pressing for some people, so we've had to record. Thank you so much everyone for joining us, and happy to pick up the questions later. Thanks everyone.
Leslie, you're just such a good facilitator. You're walking us through this important work was just so dynamic and so comforting, especially because the family was so hurt and everyone was transformed by the story. So a round of applause for you and the panel and the vulnerability that everybody shared. Virtual round of applause. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. I was hoping that Shabia might join us, but maybe family matters are pressing at home because it's around tea time in the UK. But if anyone's got any questions, happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening. Abby.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you for sharing Mohammed's story with us. It's very moving and very powerful. And I was just curious if, and I know this might be a long time down the road, but if there have been any thoughts into bringing Mohammed's story and digital storytelling into the medical school space. So before nurses and doctors and medical professionals are out into the field, if there's been thought about integrating his story into curriculum in medical school.
Yeah, lots of discussion about it. One of the university medical schools called John Moores University in Liverpool has been using Mohammed's story with mental health nurses particularly. Not that the story was about mental health, but you know, there are common themes that are in there. So we're kind of using John Moores University and the work that's going on there as a little bit of a test bed. But in one of the questions, Sarah talked about creating some resources. So to go along with the film, and the film isn't a pure digital story because it's about 17 minutes long in total. I showed you some clips put together of it. But the idea is to create some kind of leader guide educational resource so that people can use it as a resource and guide people through discussion points and things like that. So that work's ongoing around this kind of educational resource, and we're really using that university as a little bit of a test bed. So it's kind of on the thought process, but we haven't really accelerated that with any amount of speed.
And so that we can walk away together knowing a little bit more about each other in this virtual space, Abby, would you mind sharing where you're from to the level of detail you get comfortable with? Are you in the healthcare space at all?
I am not in the healthcare space. I am in instructional design, and I'm interning with the Smithsonian. So through one of the organizers, Philippa, she got me out here into the digital storytelling conference. So I'm very grateful to her and grateful to learn so many new things this past week. It's been a really lovely experience.
Thank you for sharing. Elena, where are you calling from, or what do you do in your life outside of a conference?
Hi everyone, so my name is Elena. I am a student at Montgomery College in United States, Maryland. So what I'm doing beside of the conference, I'm doing a lot of stuff. So yeah, I'm a mom of 2 children, trying to take care of them. So I'm working as a bookkeeper, and I'm trying to find my path in the future. Like I want to change my profession, and I'm not really sure what I want to do in the future. So, and also I'd like to say thank you to everyone, all participants. So the story which we just heard is very, how to say, very, like it feels very close to me, and like because we had, like, our family experienced the same experience during the COVID. So I know it's hard to share. And I also was creating a digital story, and it was one of my experience of my life. And I know it's very hard and stressful to share it in front of people. But in the same time, I think after sharing like a bad experience from your life, it helps you to reveal and to feel better. So thank you, everyone.
Telling our stories does reveal so much. It doesn't bring Mohammed back, but I think, Leslie, your data and how you're tracking who's seeing it and where the story is going is something I haven't even thought about. So thank you for informing me about that practice, that tool that you use with this story that we all potentially could benefit from adopting to heal and to see impact. And we do the work so often without looking at reflecting on where it goes and how it impacts people.
I think there's something about working in the National Health Service that is about evidence, and quite often it's really for a clinician to say, well, that isn't statistically relevant because it's a single story, it's only one person's. So what we've been doing with some of the other digital stories that we've got, there's one about a young girl, age 9, who had a sarcoma, sadly died. She wrote a bucket list. She wanted to, three things on the bucket list that she didn't do: improve the quality of food for children, have play specialists available over the weekend, and to feed parents when they're in hospital. So what we were able to do with that story is get 3 streams of work going around that work, but go back to the national surveys, because we do a national under 16 cancer patient experience survey that goes out to multiple thousand children and parents. We were able to go back to the quantitative data and find out that 87% of people said everything was okay with a play specialist. But when you looked at the free text comments, you could see that actually some children weren't getting attention. There was a play specialist there, but they weren't really playing with them. And Sophie's legacy story then crystallized the qual and the quantitative data into one story. So we've been able to make the link between qual, quant, and narrative. And that's what we're trying to do with the other stories. So someone at the moment is working at looking at the kind of health inequality data around that particular area of the UK, see if we can track something so that we move away from digital stories being, that's only one person's health. So that's the kind of bigger picture of trying to build that evidence, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for that. Laurent, where are you coming from? Share with the level of detail you feel comfortable.
My name is Laurent Deze. I'm in Maryland, also at Montgomery College, which one of those hosting this event. I really appreciate the story sharing process that you've been doing. Some of those are really touching. But the question I have is, nowadays people are used to data gathering, data analysis. When you have a single story like Muhammad is that you have been referring to, how do you use that single story to influence change in the healthcare system that may be interested in seeing multiple scenarios like that in order to really invest resources in making change?
Yeah, I think part of the change that we've been able to make, I talked about in a bit of a panel discussion, taking it to the NHS England Quality Board. So that's the kind of place where the chief nurse sits, the chief medical officer, the chief transformation officer, all the chief officers that there are for NHS England. So taking it there and have them discuss it is really great, because that gives us some influence in the system, because they then sort of share it out through their channels too. And it's interesting, originally we used to have 5 minutes for a story and 10 minutes for a discussion at the board, so 15 minutes in total. We've now got 15 minutes for the story, which is why Mohammed's story is much longer than a kind of pure digital story. Because if they want one for 15 minutes, I'll make them one that fills 15 minutes. So we now have 45 minutes at that NHS England Quality Committee. So they watch it for 15, and then they have half an hour's worth of discussion where everyone sort of takes an action. So part of the action from Mohammed's story was around that community conversation. How do we do that? How do we pick up the conversation with the hospital who delivered the care? Where's the accountability, that kind of thing. So I think there's something about being able to get in at that high level and have that support in an organisation, regardless of what if it is an organisation, regardless of what the kind of subject matter is. So today I've been to the Quality Committee and taken the story about primary care and access to general practice in the UK, and there are actions that everyone is going to take from that. So we've had no extra resource. It has all been about people really taking that story to heart, seeing the impact of it, and wanting to do something to change. So it's not quite a social movement, but there is something about the power of the story connecting to people and making people want to do something. And I think, part of the influence as well is, we talked about the Indian Muslim Welfare Society, really important that the community elders and the community leaders facilitated that discussion. So the discussion that we talked about in Leeds was with the community elders, the religious elders, people from the community, people from the healthcare system, senior, not so senior, a mix of discussions around what are we going to do to take things forward, because that's what Shabir and the family wanted. But what NHS England might have wanted to do might not have been, probably wasn't about a community conversation, would have been about accountability and improving care in the hospital. That wasn't, it is important to the family, but that wasn't the driver for the family. So there's something about the storyteller owning the story and driving the story. Whether that answers your question.
The other part of that is I find it a little puzzling how you manage to get the trust from the people you interview so that they can agree to sharing their stories. So it's one thing to be able to interview someone and get some personal stories, but then it's another thing to let them know that, oh, I'm going to share your story in such and such organization. I think you guys are really skilled to be able to do that. I wonder how many people you come across that say no, and compared to those that are willing to let you share their stories to other entities.
Yeah, most people that we do digital stories with, and just to set this in context, this is the work that NHS England are doing. I run something called the Heads of Patient Experience Network, and we put 150 people through digital storytelling training. So they all work in hospitals in the NHS in England, and they are all skilled enough to do those stories in their trust. So we're building that capacity and that network. They're also filling in the impact and outcomes frameworks for their stories. So it's part of a bigger picture. So we've done some training with the StoryCenter. We've done some training with someone who's developed a slightly different model in the UK called the Swansea model. So that story is allowing someone to tell us what they want to tell us, and then working with them to edit it down rather than create a script and record it. So dependent on the story, we do the two different methodologies, but it's part of a bigger storytelling piece about digital stories, but then also about live performance, poetry, creative arts in health, using music, drama, I'll try that again. Music, arts and drama therapy approaches. We've got a little pilot around using music arts and drama therapy to do non-verbal storytelling when people are bereaved, where they can't articulate what they need to say because it's too painful. So we're doing lots of different things and just trying to build that capability. We've got levels of consent. The consent levels are, I'm creating this story and it's just to go to that quality board, that one meeting or that one conference. We're creating the story and I'm happy as a story sharer to share it for educational purposes. Or people sometimes say you can share it anywhere, including online. People can withdraw the consent at any time. It's really difficult to remove the footprint online if they do that, because it's somewhere. And we also give people a non-branded, non-logoed copy of their story for themselves, so they can do with that what they want. Their consent is just with us, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Back to you, Emma. Anybody got any more?
I was just saying we're at our 2-minute warning, but if you don't mind dropping your information in the chat so someone could follow up with you after this discussion, that would be really great, Leslie. And
I'd also be happy to share, we have other digital stories, other impacts and outcomes frameworks on different subjects, and with a conversation, happy to share those with people where I have the consent. Perfect.
And I hope you saw in the chat that we had additional 2 people in viewing room 3. At one point, there was also 3. So they have additional for your impact statement. I think you had 9 people viewing your Mohammed's story today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a lovely next session, everyone. If you're planning to stay in this channel, it'll be Stories of Home. Refugees and immigrants speak on their stories. With Amy Hill, Fiore Braun Aragon, and Parul Wadha. And that starts at 2:45 and I appreciate you sitting and listening to a story today.
Thank you.